Chapter 1. Flicker in the Dark. The reek of warp fumes hung thick in the stale air of the depths, curling in sickly green tendrils that seeped from the walls of Undercity Skarvoltz like the fetid breath of a dying god. Muffled squeals and the clatter of distant skittering claws echoed through the bronze-wrapped tunnels of the Skaven stronghold. But here, deep in the forbidden laboratories of Sector 12, the noise of the clan above was nothing more than a vague, trembling hum. The chamber pulsed with eerie green light. Rows of rusted copper tubing, thick iron conduits, and bone-wrapped arc nodes jutted from the floor like diseased roots. Everything was coated in grime and the fine dust of powdered warpstone, catching the ambient glow and giving the whole chamber a dreamlike shimmer. Along the back wall, partially fused into the rock face, loomed the monstrosity. The Warp-Lightning Nexus engine. It's not so much a device as it was an affront to reason. Half machinery, half pulsing, twitching mass of flesh and organic growth. Its metallic limbs stretched across the ceiling, bristling with rune-carved antennae, and its central core was a bulbous sphere of polished warp crystal surrounded by an iron gyroscope constantly spinning with maddening precision. Lightning arced along its flanges, crawling like serpents over strange sigils etched in blood and oil. Tubes fed into its base, some carrying raw warpstone slurry, others pumping out thick green mist that hissed violently when exposed to the air. Before it, hunched atop a pile of warped brass schematics and chewed parchment, was Warlock-Engineer Skritch Fizzclaw. He was small, even for a Skaven, his fur patchy from radiation burns, his left ear half melted by a previous minor success that had incinerated 3 apprentices and fused their bones into the ceiling. His eyes glowed faintly behind a cracked lens gog, the green light of warp energy bleeding into his pupils. His robes were ragged and scorched in places, fitted with a bizarre harness of tubes, volt nodes, and a ticking power core embedded into his hunchback. He twitched constantly, his clawed fingers fluttering like diseased spiders as he adjusted dials and muttered curses to himself. Yes, almost ready. Nearly done. Just one more spark twist, one final coil turn, then boom flash. Glory is mine, all mine. He hissed, lips curling back to reveal jagged yellow teeth. No more hiding. No more Sneerlass from Rustfang and his pack of idiot fools. Behind him, his assistants, 4 stunted, mutilated Skaven slaves dressed in static-padded rags, stood in quivering silence, their eyes glazed, their whiskers twitching uncontrollably from prolonged exposure to warp radiation. One of them, the smallest, coughed wetly and collapsed to the ground, blood frothing from his mouth as his skin began to bubble and slough off in strips. The others didn't even turn to look. It was a daily occurrence now. Skritch didn't notice, or didn't care. He reached up and pulled a lever made of bone and copper. The Nexus hummed, then groaned, then screamed, a high-pitched, agonizing screech that caused the metal floor to warp slightly and one assistant to convulse, bleeding from his eyes. Lightning surged through the conduits, flashing between the machine's limbs and striking the ceiling in a chaotic web of power. Yes. See, breathed Skritch, shrieked, arms flailing. It lives, breathes, thinks, knows. It obeys me. But even as he cackled, the central warp crystal flickered erratically. One of the gyroscope rings halted mid-spin, grinding against its rail with a shriek of torn metal. A spark burst from a node, striking another assistant in the chest. The slave was lifted off his feet, his body spasming wildly before bursting apart like an overripe fruit, splattering the walls in red vapor and blackened fur. Skritch barely flinched. His fingers were dancing now, flipping switches, twisting nozzles, spitting orders, to no one. The instability is expected, yes, natural. The machine is stretching, growing. must temper its hunger, feed it slowly, carefully, maybe not too slowly. Must impress Arch-Warlock Virid Crit before Rustfang worms his tail. And from above, in the observation gantry, two hooded figures watched in silence. "This thing," muttered one, tail lashing behind his robes. "It will kill us all. It's not stable, not even by our standards." "Doesn't matter," hissed the other, eyes glinting. "If it works, it changes everything. If it fails," he shrugged, "it kills Fizzclaw. Win-win, yes, yes." Back in the chamber, the Nexus pulsed again, brighter this time. A sudden pulse wave burst outward, invisible to the eye, but felt in the marrow. The remaining scave slaves collapsed, unconscious or dead. The metal warped again, tools bent, glass cracked. Blood began to trickle from Skritch's left nostril. Still, he laughed. "Oh, yes. It wants to be more, to grow. I see it, I see. The Nexus is hungry, hungry. It needs to feed. Not just power, not just warpstone. It wants thoughts, souls. It is beautiful, terrible, perfect." The Warp-Lightning Nexus gave one final shriek, and then went dark. The chamber fell into silence, save for the hissing of ruptured coolant lines and the crackle of residual lightning. Skritch leaned on his staff, his eyes wide and bloodshot, foam gathering at the corner of his mouth. He looked at the smoking ruin of his laboratory, at the dead assistants, the flickering lights, the twisted cables. And he smiled. "Next time. More power," he whispered. "More life." From the shadows above, the observers turned and vanished into the tunnels. Outside, the warp winds howled through the Undercity, and in the stillness of the laboratory, the Nexus blinked. Once. Then again. Chapter 2. Sparks of Ambition. The clang of metal on metal rang out through the copper-hung corridors of Sector 12 as the iron hatch was slammed open. Hunched figures in robes and rebreathers scurried out of the way like cockroaches as Warlock-Engineer Skritch Fizzclaw stormed through the passage, his mechanical tail sparking with frustrated energy. Behind him trailed a stench of burnt fur and ozone, and the constant tick-hiss of the power core embedded in his hunched spine marked his presence like a death knell. His left eye twitched spasmodically. The scent of warp oil still clung to his robes, drenched as they were from his latest attempt to reawaken the dormant Nexus engine. It had pulsed again before blacking out, and he was certain it had felt him. A sign, yes, from the horned rat himself. He muttered to himself, his claws flexing with a metallic creak. They laughed, called me mad fool, see the Nexus was trash junk, but they see soon. The rusted elevator cage at the end of the corridor groaned as it lifted him up toward the council spire, the high, filth-slicked peak of Skarvoltz, where decisions were made through whispered threats and back-alley dismemberments. Flickering brass skull lamps lined the walls, casting long shadows over the jagged ruins of Clan Skryre. Above, the thunder of warp engines rumbled like distant artillery. When the cage opened, he stepped into a circular chamber heavy with tension and with poison. The Council of Sparks, as the local engineering assembly called itself, consisted of 9 Warlock engineers. Skritch barely noticed them. His focus was on the two figures at the center. To the right stood Warlock Rustfang, taller and sleeker than most, his robes pristine, his voice silk-wrapped venom. He was grooming his whiskers with an oiled claw when Skritch entered. To the left loomed the beast himself, Arch-Warlock Virid Crit, bulbous, bloated, and crackling with volatile power. Tubes fed into his armor from a tank of concentrated warp fuel. His face was barely visible beneath a lattice of bronze wires and polished goggles. The scent of scorched air and fresh acid trailed him like perfume. "Fizzclaw," Vritkit growled, voice modulated through a vox grill. You call a meeting without clearance. You interrupt my warp baptism ritual for this." Skritch bowed stiffly, not out of respect, but out of necessity. "I bring proof, mighty high engineer. My Nexus engine lives lives, it pulses, it thinks. Soon we can weaponize warp thoughts. Pure emotion, madness itself." Snorts of derision echoed across the room. Rustfang chuckled, sharp teeth glinting beneath his hood. Yes, and next you'll claim it can dream. He purred. Fizzclaw's machine screams and bleeds green light, but all it does is cook rats and melt walls. It's a bomb with delusions. "Shut your snout, Spock thief," Skritch snapped, pointing a claw. "Your devices are soft weak. My Nexus will obliterate the surface things, burn man-thing cities to ash dust." Ertic Crit raised a hand and silence fell. "Enough. Proof, or death-ath. That is the law of Skryre. Show results, or your meat becomes fuel. Understood, Skritch?" Skritch's grin faltered. His claws curled. Yes, I understand," he hissed. 2 days later, beneath the abandoned flux mines, a hatch hissed open. It was a graveyard of skaven ingenuity, collapsed tunnels, shattered bore drills, and tunnels warped by uncontrolled warpstone exposure. The perfect place to disappear. Skritch's small team shuffled inside behind him. They were a miserable lot. All expendables. First was Chitterig, once a promising apprentice until a failed teleportation test left his lower half fused to a rail rack. Now he skittered awkwardly on a pair of rusted wheels and spoke only in whispers. Then there was Gnock, a mute brute with both arms replaced by warp-shock gauntlets. He obeyed anything that offered him a charge. The final two were barely alive, rat skins stretched thin over twitching bone, their names lost to time. One had an extra eye in his throat, the other spoke only in high-pitched giggles. The lab they entered was crude but functional, Skritch's true sanctum now. The Nexus core had been moved, reassembled with more flesh-metal conduits, and hooked into a central pillar of warpstone-veined rock. Dozens of runes pulsed faintly in the gloom. "I ignore the fumes, yes," Skritch rasped as he connected power nodes to his spinal implant. "If lungs burst, it means you're too weak to serve the great work." He flipped a switch. The chamber rumbled. The Nexus came alive again, slow pulses, a heart reborn. Mobile Warpning crawled along the floor like hunting animals. One of the no-name assistants stepped too close. The bolt hit him center mass. His body convulsed, turned inside out, and collapsed into a pile of bubbling fur and glistening pink tubes. The other began to shriek and claw at his own eyes, blood pouring from every orifice, before he collapsed, twitching. Chitterig looked away. Gnock just stared, waiting for an order. Yes, good. It is learning what it doesn't want. This is progress. Skritch spun dials and offered prayers, not to the horned rat, but to the Nexus itself. As the lightning intensified, glyphs began appearing across the stone walls, burned into the surface by invisible claws, symbols no scathed scholar had ever recorded. One glowed red-hot, and a wailing echo filled the chamber. The Nexus spoke, not in words, but in pulses, in pain. It hungered. Skritch dropped to his knees, froth dripping from his mouth. His fur stood on end. "I'll here see you." Yes, I do," he whispered. "I will feed you all of them. Just show me how." Behind him, Chitterig stared at the engineer, and then at the machine. The Nexus blinked, once, then again. Chapter 3. First Surge. The Warp-Lightning Nexus engine pulsed in silence. It was not the silence of peace, but of tension, like the moment before a scream, the space between the spark and the blast. Deep beneath Undercity Skarvoltz, far from the clawed grip of the Council Spire and the ever-watching eyes of Arch-Warlock Vert Crit, Skritch Fizzclaw crouched on the grated floor of his hidden sanctum, claws trembling in feverish anticipation. The final phase of his secret trials was ready. The Nexus thrummed louder now, its gyroscopic rings spinning with hypnotic rhythm, orbiting the core of crackling warp crystal. It had grown since the relocation, fed by warpstone vapor and the half-melted remains of sacrificed test subjects. Strange, black veins pulsed through its chassis now, and sections of its metal plating had peeled back, revealing twitching organic coils that coiled and uncoiled like worms beneath skin. Skritch didn't mind the changes. He welcomed them. Now, yes, great thing, he crooned. Time for first surge. Time to taste the world. He gestured sharply with a voltage-scorched claw. Chitterick, calibrate flow lines, and secure the doors. No scurry-run rats to witness what they should not see. The hunchbacked apprentice rolled across the floor, his rusted wheel legs screeching with effort as he adjusted the bone crank on the warp valve control. Steam hissed. The air grew hot and oily, thick with a scent of rot and irradiated stone. In the center of the room, the Nexus pulsed once. Then again. Its light intensified, first a flicker, then a solid beam of toxic green that cast warped shadows across the walls. It sang now, a low choral hum vibrating inside bone and brain. Every hair on Skritch's body stood erect, and the others began to twitch uncontrollably. Now, begin the surge. Skritch slammed down the ignition rune with a snarl. The Nexus screamed. A blast of warp light shot upward from the core, melting the iron sealing vent and vaporizing a trio of unfortunate Skaven slaves chained too close. Their bodies erupted in bursts of fur and bone, painting the walls in arcs of red and black mist. Chitterick was thrown backwards, his wheel legs sparking as he crashed into a storage vat, splitting it open and unleashing a cloud of gaseous warpstone. Yes, perfect. Functioning at 121% efficiency. Skritch bellowed over the roar. More power! Feed it more! Nook, silent and obedient, slammed both of his warp gauntlets into the energy port, pumping additional current into the Nexus core. The machine shuddered with pleasure. Cracks began forming in the crystal casing, bleeding raw green light. Pipes burst. Lightning lanced between brass nodes, arcing across the chamber and searing anything too slow or too stupid to dodge. From the ventilation shaft above, something thudded, then scratched, then squealed. Dozens of eyes shimmered in the darkness. Then came the swarm. Vermin, once mundane rats of Skarvoltz, now twisted by the excess warp energy leaking through the floor grates. Their fur had sloughed off in patches, replaced by glistening sores. Extra limbs thrashed from distended torsos. Their mouths opened vertically, full of mismatched needle teeth. Some no longer had eyes. Some had too many. They came in a shrieking wave, leaping down onto the machinery, scrambling over failed reactors, swarming toward the Nexus like flies to rot. One struck a conduit. The resulting explosion shredded it in midair and ignited its packmates, who continued to flail and attack, even as they burned alive. No, not now. Now too soon, Skritch snarled, ripping a jagged-toothed blade from his belt. He leapt into the fray, hacking down one abomination that had tried to gnaw on the Nexus coil. Its blood hissed as it struck his robes, melting the cloth down to the bone. Chitterick screamed behind him, long and high, a child's wail in the voice of a rat. He clutched his head as his eyes rolled back, pupils dilating until only white remained. He crumpled, shaking violently, shrieking nonsense in a tongue that had never belonged to Skaven. The warp gas had sunk into his mind. It sees us, It names us. You cannot stop the coming surge, Fizzclaw. The voice was not his. Skritch turned, eyes wide, teeth bared. What do who said that? But Chitterig was unconscious now, drooling green foam, twitching in a spreading pool of his own blood. Above them, the Nexus's pulse faltered. The gyroscope buckled. The central warp crystal shattered. There was no sound, just light. A moment of blinding green purity, all motion stilled. Even the mutants froze. Then came the boom. The explosion tore through the lower wing of the lab, vaporizing walls, liquefying flesh, and sending a surge of energy through every ungrounded surface. One of the support towers buckled and crashed downward, crushing the holding cages and the remaining test subjects inside. The heat melted the stairs, the power conduits, the auxiliary coils. When the smoke cleared, Skritch stood in the center of a crater, his robes charred, skin blistered, half his tail gone. Around him, the ruins smoldered. The Nexus was inert, cracked and leaking dark fluid that sizzled as it touched the stone. The madness-scorched vermin were gone. Only scorched bones remained. Nox's torso was still twitching, headless, the warp gauntlets fused to the metal floor. Skritch coughed, hacking blood into his palm. His vision swam with flickers of green static. The Nexus had surged too soon, too violently. But it had worked. And then he smelled it. Not the smoke, not the blood, but something far worse. Sabotage. That stink. Warp oil mixed with chemicals he never used. The power feed had spiked. Someone had tampered with it. Not overloaded by the Nexus, but pushed from outside. His eyes narrowed. Rusfeng, he hissed. Horse. Of course. That conniving backbiter had sent spies. Had tried to steal the surge, maybe even kill him in the process. But he hadn't died. No. Skritch Fizzclaw never dies. He improves. He looked at the wreckage. The Nexus still pulsed, weak but alive. A grin spread across his burned face. Sabotage fail. I live, live, you try kill me, but now you only feed my vengeance. He dragged himself across the floor, ignoring the blood trailing behind him. Next surge will not be test, it will be war. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Warp. Darkness settled over the ruins of the lower laboratory like a shroud, heavy and oppressive, pressing against the cracked walls and burnt rafters. Only the erratic pulse of green lightning, faint, stuttering, remained to prove that the Warp-Lightning Nexus engine had survived. The air stank of charred bone and chemical vapor, thick with the unmistakable tang of melted warpstone and scorched flesh. Flies buzzed lazily over corpses still twitching days after the explosion, muscles remembering life long after the soul had been boiled away. Skritch Fizzclaw stood in the center of the cratered floor, motionless, his one good eye locked on the Nexus core. His other eye had ruptured during the blast, now nothing more than a pulsing sack of blood and cracked lens glass. He hadn't eaten in days, hadn't slept in longer. But still he stood. Listening. The Nexus pulsed, and the voice came again. Skritch. It was not a voice in the way others spoke, not a sound heard through ears, but a vibration in his bones, a tingling in his teeth, a pressure behind his eyes. It spoke in the patterns of flickering light, in the scraping of metal against stone, in the rising scent of ozone and burning copper. Every pulse of energy carried meaning. Every flicker of the dying crystal core was a word. Isabel may, yes, you make perfect thing. Skritch shuddered, his spine twitching under the pressure of the words. Yes, I hear you, I understand. You are alive, awake, not just machine thing, but blessed thing, blessed by the Horn Rat himself. He dropped to his knees and bowed low, forehead scraping against the cracked floor, slicing open his skin. He didn't feel the blood. This is the gift, the calling. I am chosen, favored. They laughed, mocked. But I see now. I see what they do not see. He looked up, and the Nexus had changed. It no longer resembled a device he had built from schematics and salvage. It had grown, mutated. Iron limbs had twisted into spined tendrils, curled inwards like a hatching insect. Flesh had sprouted between armor plates, pale and glistening, twitching with spasms. One segment of the gyroscope had fused with the floor itself, as if digested into the stone. Warp energy crackled around the core with no power source, no input, siphoning energy from the very air around. Cables that had once been inert now writhed like veins, pulsing in rhythm with Skritch's own heartbeat. Tiny chittering voices echoed in the chamber, softer than a whisper, sharper than a scream. "Skritch, Skritch, Skritch," they hissed in perfect unison. "We think, with you." He laughed, high and wild, clawing at the skin of his chest. He scratched until he bled, until warp light bled through him. But others were watching. From the rusted access shaft above, Chitterick watched his master from the shadows. His body bore the burn marks of the explosion. Patches of fur gone, one eye now a milky white orb. But he had survived. Barely. And what he saw below was not genius. It was madness. Skritch spoke to nothing, bowed to his machine, danced in place when the Nexus pulsed, shrieking laughter and slapping his own face with joy. And the Nexus moved. Chitterick had seen it. With no hands, no gears turning, no pistons, just a slow, creeping shift in the cables, in the shape of its limbs, in the eyes that now occasionally blinked from between layers of fused metal and sinew. It was no longer just a machine. It was becoming, and Skritch was feeding it. 3 days later, more rats went missing. Skritch didn't mind. They were sacrifices, unworthy ones, whose meat and bones the Nexus devoured through osmosis, drained of color and mass simply by proximity. A scout from Clan Mulder came looking for missing specimens. Skritch offered him a tour. The scout never returned. That night, the Nexus hummed louder. Skritch wept as he carved crude runes into his own flesh. "I offer blood. Pain. Soul. Take me, take me." He pressed his hand to the warp core and screamed as lightning raced up his arm, bursting through his shoulder, charring his fur. He collapsed, twitching. When he awoke, the Nexus was whispering again. More, give more. Soon hallucinations began. He saw rats crawling beneath his skin, tiny faces with dozens of eyes peering from under his fingernails. He saw other Skaven watching him from the corners of the room, mouths stitched shut, bleeding from their eyes. He heard the scraping of claws on the walls, even when alone. But worst of all was the figure. Bull. Cloaked in shadow, its face obscured, save for a single green flame in the center of its head. It spoke, with the voices of 1,000 Skaven, screaming in unison. "You are mine," it said, "and you are ready." Chitterick finally fled the lab. He bolted through the vent shafts, gasping, dragging his broken limbs over rusted mesh, ignoring the gashes in his palms, ignoring the way the walls seemed to pulse with breath. He knew what he had to do. He had to tell the Council. Skritch Fizzclaw had lost his mind. But worse, something else had found it. Chapter 5. Shadows of Sabotage. The scent of blood never truly faded from the halls beneath Undercity Skarvoltz. It lingered in the iron, in the stone, in the warp-tainted dust that settled thick over everything. Down in the scorched depths, where light was choked by pipes and walls sweated toxins, Skritch Fizzclaw worked with renewed fervor, his hands a blur of blood-stained motion, his claws etched with burn scars and his robes stiff with dried ichor. The Nexus engine had grown again. It now resembled nothing like the original schematics. Gone were the clean gyrotoruses and sleek warpstone reservoirs. In their place were veined, pulsing conduits that throbbed like arteries. The warp core had reshaped into a crude, almost organic bulb, its surface crusted with crystalline tumors that glowed dimly with malicious light. Copper tubes had split and unfurled like insect mandibles. The machine whispered constantly now, not just in his mind, but audibly, in clicks and guttural moans that echoed off the chamber walls. Skritch no longer cared about food, sleep, or hygiene. His mind was wire-taut with ambition and paranoia, fueled by warp energy and madness. He murmured constantly under his breath, licking his broken lips, his teeth blackening with each passing day. And still he built. Until they came. The attempt was expertly timed. A power flux had been triggered elsewhere in the tunnels, diverting the flow of energy from his sub-reactors and drawing Skritch away from the Nexus chamber to manually reroute power through the backup rails. He cursed and hissed, dragging his voltage-spike toolkit down a dark corridor, muttering threats about idiot slaves and sabotage. Again, always sabotage, under his breath. He didn't see the assassin until the first blade hit him. It wasn't a deep cut, just a sharp, needle-thin puncture between the shoulder blades, slicing through cloth and skin and barely grazing bone. But the poison acted instantly. Skritch screamed as his muscles locked. He collapsed to the ground, twitching, vision hazed, bile rising in his throat. From the shadows stepped Snikas, Rustfang. He was lean and sinuous, his fur sleek and well-groomed, his robes clean and gilded with minor warp inscriptions. Twin-hooked daggers gleamed in his claws, smeared with fresh venom. His eyes were cold with triumph. "You rise too fast, Fizzclaw," he hissed, voice like oil poured over broken glass. "Too high too soon. You build things you do not understand. You threaten the balance. You must fall. Die. Now." Skritch drooled blood as he clawed at the floor, trying to reach for the volt disruptor on his belt. Snickers kicked it away and knelt beside him. "Council says nothing," he murmured into Skritch's twitching ear. "I say what must be done. You take too much power. But your death will be quiet. Lost. Down here. Forgotten." He raised the dagger. But the Nexus screamed. Not aloud, not with sound, but with force. Every light in the corridor blinked green. Pipes hissed and burst, the air filled with a sudden magnetic charge so thick it made Snaj's fur stand on end. From the end of the tunnel, something crawled forward, slow, slick, and utterly silent. It was no Skaven. It had once resembled one, perhaps, a half-devoured assistant or a scavenger too close to the engine during its last pulse. Now, it was a mass of fused metal and sinew, its bones wrapped in copper wire, its face split down the center to reveal a mouth full of teeth that turned endlessly like a meat grinder. Sneakers turned just as it lunged. It struck with feral speed, claws of rebar and rusted copper slashing across his back. He screamed as he twisted, slicing one blade into its neck, but there was no blood, only green vapor and the hiss of warflesh parting. The thing shrieked in static and slammed its head into Sneaka's jaw, cracking bone and knocking him backward into the wall. Skritch's paralysis had faded just enough for him to roll onto his side, gasping, eyes wide with delight. "Yes, yes, protect me. Good, good servant." The creature turned to him briefly, chittering in a language not meant for mortal ears, then returned to Snyx. It grabbed the rival engineer by the shoulders, dragging him back into the darkness, screaming. The echoes of his shrieks, wet, panicked, final, filled the tunnel until only the chewing remained. Hours later, Skritch stood over the still twitching remains. He didn't recognize what was left of Rustfang's body. Most of it had been peeled, stripped, absorbed. Only the tail remained, nailed to a support beam as a trophy. Skritch bent down, sliced off one of the flayed hands, and fed it to the Nexus. The machine moaned with satisfaction. A bolt of lightning crawled along its surface, and the walls of the chamber pulsed in response. "You protect me now," Skritch said softly, reverently. "We are one mind. We grow together." Still limping, still bleeding, he returned to the inner sanctum and sealed it. With Rustfang gone, the council would stir. Questions would be asked. But he didn't care. Let them look. Let them suspect. They would find only sealed doors and the creeping echo of something far worse growing beneath their feet. He ordered Chitterick, still mostly broken but loyal, to begin rerouting access tunnels. They would go deeper now, below the city flesh, beneath the stone, where no eyes watched, where no council whispered. There, the Nexus would evolve. There he would ascend. Chapter 6. Test Fire. The chamber had become a cathedral. Once a laboratory, a cramped, soot-streaked hellhole lined with copper piping and blood-rusted machinery, Skritch Fizzclaw's sanctum had transformed into a warped, pulsing womb of science and madness. The Nexus engine no longer simply stood, it loomed. Its roots had burrowed deep into the bedrock beneath Undercity Skarvoltz, fusing with the tunnels like a cancer. Its core was now a twisted sphere of warp crystal wrapped in a carapace of plated iron and warp flesh, pulsating with malignant light. Jagged arcs of lightning danced between its limbs, searing the stone and flashing strange symbols across the walls, glyphs of a language no Skaven scholar dared translate. Skritch stood at the control dais, hunched over a panel of bone levers and organ-wired gauges. His robes had fused to his body in places, blackened by previous surges. Half his face was a mass of scar tissue, his left eye replaced with a glowing rune lens implanted directly into the socket. The day was no experiment. Today was demonstration. Targeting crystal locked, he barked to Chitterick, whose limbs had been replaced with twitching prosthetics of bone and brass. Surface structure man-thing fortification coordinates stable. Power nodes fulfilled. Begin test fire countdown. A keening whine filled the chamber as the Nexus began drawing in ambient warp energy, pulling from every torch, from every room, from the air itself. Stones cracked under pressure. Green lightning clawed through the room, illuminating the sacrificial remnants of Skritch's previous assistants, nailed to the walls in ritual patterns. 5, 4, 3. Above, on the surface of the world, in the crumbling borderlands of the Empire, the old imperial watchfort of Bardenfels stood in silence. Deserted for decades after the Black Plague, its moss-coated walls now served only as a nesting ground for vultures and feral dogs. The forest had reclaimed its gates, roots curling over stone like a patient predator. The ground trembled. A low humming rose from beneath the soil, deep and hungry, growing louder with each passing second, and said, "Phoenix." The Nexus exploded with light. Not an explosion of heat or fire, but of raw, screaming energy. A beam of concentrated warp light surged upward through the stone, through layers of earth and ruin, through bedrock and forest, until it erupted into the sky in a geyser of green fire. For miles away it was visible, a sickly pillar of lightning spiraling into the clouds, distorting the wind, warping birds in flight into shrieking monstrosities that dropped from the air in pieces. At Bardenfels, the effect was immediate and absolute. The beam struck the fortress square in its decayed heart. First, the stones vibrated, shivering like animals sensing death. Then they cracked, crumbled, and finally vaporized. In a single instant, the entire structure, its towers, its walls, the very earth beneath it, was atomized into warp dust, sucked into the column of energy and scattered into the wind. A circular crater, miles wide, was left behind. The surrounding trees twisted and blackened, their bark sloughing off in chunks. Animals caught in the blast radius didn't simply die. They unraveled, reduced to clumps of flesh and hair that screamed long after their mouths were gone. Back below, Skritch watched it all unfold through a scrying shard mounted in a calcified eye socket. He trembled, not in fear, but in ecstasy. It works. It works, he cackled, saliva dribbling from cracked lips. Not just weapon, not just death, but purity, cleansing, glorious obliteration. The Nexus purred like a content beast, draining excess energy into the floor. The very rock beneath it now glowed with veins of unstable warpstone, mutating under the prolonged exposure. Skritch turned to Chitterick, seizing the twitching assistant by the collar. Did you see it? Witness true ascension. No more clawing for scraps, no more grovel begging for warpstone crumbs. They will come to me. I have the key. And they did. By the next cycle, the tunnels were not silent. A procession approached, hooded, robed, stinking of incense and prophecy. The gray seers had arrived. Flanked by bodyguards with glassy eyes and trembling staves, they moved with slow precision. Their leader, an aged blind-furred seer named Razik the Pale, was supported by a levitating palanquin that hissed and clicked with every breath he took. With them came the flesh crafters of Clan Mulder, hulking, drooling packmasters with collars of bone and chains of iron, each one dragging behind them vats of bile and cages filled with groaning things that should not live. Skritch met them at the inner gates, hands clasped, body twitching. You come to beg, or to see the truth of my design. Razik spoke with a voice like burning parchment. We come because the world above howled. The winds of magic were torn open. You rip-rent a hole in aether. That was not sanctioned. Skritch hissed. I do not need your permission. I prove greatness. The man-things above are gone. Gone. I show strength. Do you deny my brilliance? A low growl rumbled from one of the packmasters. You hide your thing. You hoard what could be shared. Why not let us improve it? Flesh-bound coils, living batteries. We could make it walk, make it hunt. Skritch laughed, a harsh, broken sound. No, it is mine. It speaks to me, only me. It needs no others. Razik's eyes narrowed, though they were milky white and blind. You forget yourself, engineer. You draw attention not just of council, but of things deeper, darker. The Nexus growled behind them. A single pulse. The seers flinched. The Mulder beasts whimpered. Even Razik paused. Skritch turned, gazing upon the now living engine with manic love. You will respect it. You will fear it. Or I will show you what I showed the man-things. For a moment, silence. Then Razik spoke again, softer now. Very well, Fizzclaw, but this is your one warning. The Council will not forget. Share your secrets or be cleansed. They turned and left, the warp haze still vibrating around them. Skritch stood, claws twitching, and muttered into the air. Let them come. Let them all come. Behind him, the Nexus blinked. Twice, and then it smiled. Chapter 7. Echoes of Power. The air had changed. There was a rhythm now, subtle at first. A pulse that throbbed in the stone and the steel, that hummed through the pipes, that made water drip in syncopated beats. Like a slow, patient heartbeat, but it wasn't from a heart. It came from the Nexus. It was the Nexus, deep in the bowels of Undercity Skarvoltz, where the stone had blackened and warped from prolonged warp exposure. The great machine beast pulsed with unnatural life. Its warp flesh heaved with every surge of energy, its pulsating crystal core now webbed with sinews and cables, like veins and arteries wrapping around a cancerous organ. Every second it pulsed, Skritch Fizzclaw grew stronger. In matter, he no longer spoke in full sentences. His words were broken, clipped, punctuated by screeches and fits of wild, shaking laughter. He scratched symbols into the walls with his own claws, speaking to things that weren't there. His back had hunched grotesquely from the fused armor and biomechanical implants feeding directly from the Nexus. Tubes ran from the machine into his spine, his skull, his soul. They fed him power, and they fed on him in return. But he didn't care. He refused the Council's demands, refused to share, refused to yield. This is mine," he shrieked, spit flying from yellowed fangs. "Built grown from my mind, my blood. No fool-seers, no beast-mongers. They will not steal my glory." And so he prepared for war. The first of the warp ghouls had once been simple Skaven slaves, barely fed, half-naked, stupid things meant for labor and sacrifice. But when exposed to the Nexus's ambient energy field, especially the unshielded pulse emissions, they changed. Bones warped, muscles twisted. Some grew second jaws, others developed redundant limbs that twitched independently of the brain. One sprouted chitinous growths from its spine that jabbed outward like spears, each one dripping phosphorescent ichor. Skritch saw potential. He began dragging the dying and the mad to the Nexus. He wrapped their limbs in copper wire, fused warpstone into their rib cages, and left them in the radiation chambers for days. Many screamed until their throats bled, then died, melting into puddles of green froth and bone meal sludge. But the ones who lived, they came back different. They didn't speak anymore. Their eyes had rotted out or glowed like coals. Their bodies never stopped twitching. They no longer obeyed orders. They felt Skritch's will and acted on it before he spoke. Like limbs of the Nexus. He gave them crude armor bolted directly into their skin. He wrapped their claws in hooked blades and embedded screaming warp nodes into their skulls that pulsed with pain until they lunged to attack anything near. Dozens of them. They crawled the tunnels, slinking through shadows, howling like beasts. They feasted on vermin, on prisoners, on the weak. Some clung to ceilings, dripping saliva thick with warp residue. Others burrowed into the walls, appearing only when the Nexus summoned them. These were Skritch's children now, his warp ghouls, and with them he sealed his sanctum. The Nexus's heartbeat grew louder. Now even Chideric, half machine and brain-boiled, staggered as he passed too close to it. He clawed at his own face. He screamed in dreams. He spoke in reverse. The warp energy bled through the chamber like a fever. Walls sweated green. Stone oozed. Rats died before reaching the lab's threshold, their bodies flaking into ash with a single pulse. The air grew thick with thought. Not Skaven thought, but something deeper. Alien, ancient, hungry. And the Nexus began to change again. Its pulses began to mimic speech, words now, commands, not in any Skaven tongue, but in echoes. They burned in Skritch's mind like brands. Field, hope, defend. Ascent. Skritch obeyed. He no longer needed to plan. The Nexus told him what to do. What parts to weld, what runes to carve, what limbs to harvest. The machine dreamed through him, using his body like a tool, and in return it gave him purpose. Far above, others felt it. The gray seers writhed in their sleep, their third eyes bursting open with psychic agony. Packmasters found their beasts frothing, chewing at their own legs to stop the whispers. Warpstone reacted violently across the city, crystals humming in resonance with some buried frequency. The Undercity began to change. Entire sectors flickered with green light. Mutations surged among the Skaven populace, tails splitting, bones snapping into new shapes. A madness spread through the pipes, through the walls, carried on the Nexus's pulse. And in the dark, the warp ghouls hunted. They dragged spies into vents, ripped saboteurs apart, and hung their limbs like decorations. One council agent was found crucified upside down, flayed and sewn back together in the shape of a screaming rune. The message was clear. Stay away. In the deepest pit, Skritch stood before the Nexus. His eyes bled from overexposure. His bones creaked with each movement, but his grin was wide. Too wide. "It hears me, it loves me," he whispered, swaying as the heartbeat thudded again. The Nexus answered. The walls trembled, and far above, the sky cracked just a little. Chapter 8. Crackling Conspiracies. In the steaming gut pipes of Undercity Skarvoltz, beneath the endless din of sparking coil furnaces and warp turbine screams, the meeting chamber of Sector Prime pulsed with low conspiratorial menace. It was lit by a flickering plasma vault, suspended above a table made entirely from dissected bone and shattered weapon components, each piece a trophy from some failed experiment or betrayal. 9 high-ranking Warlock-Engineers encircled it, their robes marked with the sigils of Clan Skryre's elite cabal, their faces half covered in respirators, lenses, and crackling arc masks. Sparks danced from their rebreathers as they whispered into the steam-hissed dark. And at the center, standing tall with his arms folded behind his back, was Warlock Prime Thrizz Voltclaw. "Fizzclaw has gone too far," Thrizz hissed, his voice distorted through a vox modulator laced with static and venom. "1 test fire. 1. And the world screams. You feel the pulse, yes, yes. The warp storms gnash at our borders. The gray seers mutter in dreams. The city twists around his filth machine." "Worse," rasped another warlock, his scalp replaced with a metallic dome. "My engineers go missing. Whole sectors now bend to his Nexus pulses. The tunnels writhe like flesh. Warp ghouls claw my observation windows." "He has warped the very warrens," spat another. "The engine feeds now. It is alive." "Hermit does not answer summons," muttered a fourth. "Refuses war council. He's building something. We don't know what." There was a moment of grim silence. Then Thrizz nodded once. "Then we purge, before it grows further, before it becomes him." He slammed a clawed hand down onto the table. A flash of green light seared the air as the hololithic emitter activated, displaying the jagged blueprints of Skritch's sanctum, scraped together from stolen surveillance drones and warp radar pings. The map pulsed with faint echoes of power, half corrupted by warp interference. "We send in screaming Unit 17A Warlock assassins, silent kill-trained. They go down, down, through side vent shafts and sewer grids. No alarms, no alerts." They're at it, gnashing teeth. "And leave Fizzclaw's dust." "And teeth." Fine, Thrizz snapped. "Make it happen." The tunnel was black. No lights, no warmth. Just the distant hum of the Nexus beating like a buried heart. Screaming Unit 17A advanced silently, cloaked in stealth warp fields that rippled like oil. They were not soldiers. They were engineered killers, augmented with shock flesh, bone-hinged limbs, and visors fused directly into their skulls. There were 5 of them, each one armed with short-pulse warp blades, voltage grenades, and rune jammers to distort magical interference. Their leader, Vrax Needlefang, led the descent with fluid grace, slipping through cracks and tunnels that twisted like the intestines of a dying titan. His orders were simple: kill Fizzclaw, burn the engine, return with whatever's left. But even before reaching the perimeter, things felt wrong. One of the squad's visors began to glitch, displaying flickers of skein eyes in every shadow. The second operative's respirator began laughing in a voice that mimicked their mother. The third dropped dead without warning, flesh collapsing into itself, ribs curving inward like blades. "No. Keep moving, jam interference," Needlefang growled, slamming a null node onto the dead agent's skull and watching it disintegrate in silence. They entered the outer sanctum. What they saw was sacrilege. The walls bled green. Actual veins pulsed along the ceiling. Faces, not carvings but groans, stared from the support pillars, their mouths open in eternal screams. Blood bubbled from the corners of the room like resin, flowing into copper troughs that pulsed with unstable power. Warp ghouls lay sprawled in clusters, sleeping in twitching huddles, limbs tangled, but as the assassins stepped closer, the ghouls twitched, then jerked, then howled. The silence shattered. Needlefang's team activated warp pulse disruptors, bathing the room in bursts of searing green light. 2 ghouls were atomized instantly, another exploded as a volt blade carved through its spine. But they kept coming. More poured from the vents, from the walls. Some crawled on ceilings. Some didn't have legs, just trails of mutated muscle pulling them forward, their jaws distending wider and wider with every shriek. And leapt onto an assassin and tore his helmet off, vomiting acidic bile directly into his skull cavity. The Warlock assassin thrashed as his brain melted, claws digging into his own eyes. Another ghoul pinned an agent and rammed rebar through his abdomen, laughing in broken syllables, before dragging him into a vent, still alive. Needlefang screamed for retreat, but the exit tunnels were gone. Literally gone. The walls had shifted, closed in, become flesh. The Nexus wailed in the distance, the pulse growing louder. DOM. Needlefang turned to run, but a long metallic tail wrapped around his leg and yanked him into the dark. High above, in the council chamber, Thrizz waited. It saw. An hour passed. Never 2. Then the only thing that returned was the helmet of one of the Warlock assassins, tossed through a sealed pipe, filled with blood and a single bone rune carved into the forehead. Thrizz hissed, clenching his fists. This wasn't just rebellion. This was deicide. Fizzclaw had built a god, and now it was awake. Chapter 9. The Warp Quake. It began with a pulse. Not the soft rhythmic hum that the Nexus had exhaled for weeks, but a violent, lung-punching detonation of energy that rolled through the stone like a thunderclap trapped in a coffin. The floor trembled, sending loose bolts skittering down the pipes. Every tunnel light flickered and burst, spraying shattered crystal across the ground in a sudden, blinding flash. And then came the screams. From every corner of the undertunnels, from the bone-ribbed walls to the sewage arteries choked with slime and the hissing cogwheels of dormant machines. Skaven cried out in unison. Claws clutched skulls, ears bled. Warp-attuned minds snapped like overwound springs as the Nexus engine surged with power far beyond its containment limits. At the heart of it all, Skritch Fizzclaw stood beneath the machine, his arms outstretched, fur soaked with blood, his voice cracked and raw from days without rest. His eyes, one biological, one glowing warp lens, rolled wildly as he screamed praises to the shrieking green star pulsing above him. More, more! It lives, breathes, feeds. Ascend, ascend, ascend. The Nexus didn't respond with words anymore. It had transcended language. It sang. The notes were composed of light agony, static, and memory, every tone ripped through the chamber like a sonic blade, tearing holes in air, thought, and even time. The machine vibrated against the warpstone-ribbed walls, its roots now fused directly into the bedrock of Skarvoltz. Its crystal core had swelled and split, leaking molten green ichor that flowed like lava, burning, mutating, changing everything it touched. Then came the overload. Skritch didn't see it. He felt it just before it struck. A moment of weightlessness, a split second where every molecule in his body recoiled in terror. His fur stood up so sharply it pierced his skin. And then the Nexus howled. A globe of energy erupted from its core, expanding outward in a blast of pure warp force. The laboratory, already warped and gnarled beyond recognition, folded. Steel bent inward like paper. Machines twisted and screamed as they were crushed into singularities, and then reborn as twitching, mutated carcasses of what they once were. The pulse didn't stop at the walls. Far above, the foundations of Undercity Skarvoltz shuddered. Tunnels cracked. Support pillars snapped like brittle bone. Sectors not even connected to Skritch's sanctum began to buckle. Entire mining shafts collapsed in on themselves. Steam ducts ruptured, releasing clouds of superheated vapor that melted dozens of workers in seconds. A reactor coil exploded in Sector 17. 2 entire Skaven factories fell into the earth. One collapsed while mid-shift, swallowing 500 workers in an instant. But worse than the destruction was the effect. The warp energy surged through the city's veins like poison. Warpstone caches spontaneously detonated, bathing whole districts in radiation. Rats mutated in real time, screaming as their bodies twisted into horrid forms. Teeth sprouted from eyes, flesh turned to glass. Skeletons inverted themselves with wet, snapping sounds. Even gray seers screamed in panic. They could feel it, something beneath them, pulsing with awareness. Something awake? Back in the core chamber, Skritch lay on his side, half crushed beneath a broken control panel. One leg was gone from the thigh down, vaporized in the blast. Blood soaked the floor, but he didn't care. He was smiling. The machine, it grows. Yes, yes, I saw the sky inside, he whispered deliriously, licking blood from his own claws. It showed me stars, teeth, the horned one's belly. I saw. The Nexus had calmed, slightly. Its pulses now slowed, but each one felt deeper, more resonant, like the heartbeat of a leviathan sleeping under a thin crust of earth. It needed containment or relocation. If it stayed where it was, it would bring the entire city down. And so, crawling through the twisted remains of his lab, Skritch gave his last command of the cycle. Dig deeper. We go down. His warp ghouls responded instantly, bursting from the shadows with tools made of sharpened bone and scavenged metal. They tore into the earth like termites, carving a new descent into the black belly of the Under-Empire. The escape route would lead through forgotten catacombs, through collapsed ruins and plague pits untouched for centuries, places not even Clan Mulder dared tunnel. His team had been terminated. As the ghouls dug, Chitterick approached, limping on one ruined leg. His eyes glowed with low intelligence, his jaw fused partially shut. Master, stabilizers gone, warp levels rising. We will not survive next pulse. Skritch laughed, clutching at a shard of molten warpstone. No, we don't survive. We transcend. He gave one last glance at the ruined chamber, the screaming walls, the piles of ash that had once been Skaven. Then he vanished into the pit. Behind him, the Nexus began to move. Not just pulsed, a shift. It dragged itself forward, inch by inch, tendrils twitching, cables snapping from the walls as it followed its maker into the deep, like a monstrous insect following the scent of blood. Above, the city continued to fall apart. What below? A new empire was being born, one heartbeat at a time. Chapter 10. Refractions. The new sanctum was not built, it was birthed. Deep beneath the fractured bones of Undercity Skarvoltz, past collapsed plague vaults and flooded execution pits, the Nexus carved out its own cathedral in the rotted womb of the world. It fused stone and scrap like a spider weaving with blood. Walls bled amber light. Warp gas vents pulsed like gills. The very air was thick and wet, every breath a swallow of rusted heat and whispering madness. Skritch Fizzclaw stood at the center, robes in tatters, hair matted with blackened oil and blood. His remaining leg twitched constantly beneath the weight of its mechanical brace, powered by an exposed wire that connected to his spine like a parasite. His claws were warped into tools, flesh and metal indistinguishable now. He hadn't blinked in hours, or days, because he couldn't stop seeing. He began the moment the Nexus settled in its new womb, its roots plunging into the soft, warp-saturated soil like a burrowing insect. A pulse echoed out, not through matter, but through time. Skritch reeled. Then he saw. A vision, sharp, sudden, realer than real, seized his mind. Skritch, crowned in bronze and bone, marched atop a mountain of fallen gray seers. His mechanical limbs hissed steam, trailing arcs of lightning as warp ghouls surged behind him. Cities fell beneath green flame. Screaming banners of Clan Skryre were trampled as a new sigil, his own, burned across the ruins. He stood at the altar of the Horned Rat, cradling the Nexus in his arms like an infant. The god whispered to him, not in madness, but in adoration. "Chosen," it hissed. "Ascended king of Skavenk." Then another vision snapped into place. A throne forged of machine and meat. Skritch, bloated with warp energy, fused to the Nexus itself. His body stretched into the architecture, veins trailing through the city's core. Below him, warlords bowed, their tails amputated in submission. He blinked, and armies of man-things exploded into red mist. Another flicker. The world shattered. Skritch stood alone, laughing atop a pillar of screaming souls. No sun, no sky, only the Nexus, pulsing with infinite hunger. He staggered, laughing, coughing blood. See, I am the end and the beginning. They were wrong, all of them. They called me mad, traitor, fool. But the machine shows me truth. Behind him, Chitarik watched in silence. The assistant's body had begun to degrade. His limbs were corroded, bone showing through exposed gearwork. His once proud tools now dragged behind him, too heavy for his rotting spine. His mind pulsed with fever, every thought a haze of static. But he still remembered enough to know this was wrong. He watched as Skritch staggered through the chamber, clawing at walls that no longer obeyed physics, mumbling to hallucinations that left burns in the air. "Master," Chitarik rasped through cracked lips. "You speak to nothing. You scream at walls. The machine changes you." Skritch spun, eyes wild. "Fool slave. I see what you cannot. I see time every time. All paths lead to me. I was made for this." He reached forward and gripped Chitarik's shoulder. The assistant screamed. Not from pain, but from what he saw. The Nexus surged and threw its pulse through both their minds, linking them, even for a moment. And in that instant, Chitarik saw Skritch's futures. Skritch screaming as the Nexus consumes him, his flesh stretched across the walls like a tapestry. Skritch stabbing the Horned Rat in the heart and eating it raw. Skritch, curled in the ruins of the world, begging for death that never comes. Skritch reigning for 10,000 years as a god of ruin. Skritch smiling, as his last followers devour him from the legs up. Chitterick dropped to the floor, sobbing, steam venting from his ribs. No more. No more visions. It is not fate, it is madness. Skritch laughed, high and sharp, like broken glass. No, not madness, choice. The Nexus shows me all paths. I choose the one where I win, where I survive, where I kill them all. But even as he spoke, the Nexus pulsed again. And this time the vision it gave wasn't of Skritch's triumph. It was of the Nexus itself, grown so massive it blotted out the city, fused with the remains of Skritch's body, using him like a shell, Skaven crawling from its open mouth, mindless, hollow. The world nothing but pulsing green ruin. And Skritch, buried somewhere in its core, screaming, forever. He fell to his knees, blood pouring from his mouth. Chitterick, barely able to stand, staggered forward. Destroy it. End it. Please, Master. You still can, before it grows too strong. Skritch didn't answer. He just turned slowly and smiled. You still don't understand. It is not me who feeds the Nexus. It is you. It is all of you. Every whisper, every breath, every betrayal. You made it strong, and now it shows me the world as it should be. The Nexus pulsed again. Chitterick screamed, dropped to the ground, and began to convulse, his limbs bending the wrong way as the visions returned, stronger, more invasive. Skritch stood, backlit by the pulsing green heart of his god mission, eyes glowing, teeth bared. Soon, the others will see too. I will show them. The Nexus throbbed, and time bled around him. Chapter 11. Siege of Sparks. The silence before the storm was brief. Then came the screeching cacophony of war. From the fractured caverns and blast-choked arteries of the lower Under-Empire, the storm of Clan Skryre's vengeance began its march. A force assembled in desperation and fury, hundreds of Warlock-Engineers, doom-wheel crews, storm-vermin shock lines, and lightning archers, flanked by globadiers and bone-gnawed Skaven slave fodder. Their eyes glowed with a single shared purpose. Skritch Fizzclaw must die. Not for heresy, not for blasphemy, but for his success. The lead elements reached the outskirts of the lower sanctum, the outer tunnel arteries long since warped by exposure to the Nexus's pulsing emissions. The very rock had become metallic and vascular, slick with oozing crystal sap and flickering with residual energy. Rats sent to scout ahead returned sobbing, teeth growing inward, speaking in voices not their own. Still, the command to advance was given. The first Skryre strike came in a torrent of lightning-charged shrapnel, fired from modified warp cannons dragged on rusted treads. The blast tore into the cavern mouth, vaporizing the twisted entry flesh and blowing open a path into the sanctum. They charged. Storm vermin howled as they surged forward, blades sparking, tails lashing. The walls themselves screamed as they were breached. Acidic blood poured from the ruptured entryway as if the mountain itself had been wounded. Inside, the Nexus stirred. Skritch knelt in front of it, whispering incomprehensible litanies. Chitterick, now more machine than flesh, limped at his side, shuddering, barely holding himself upright as sparks dripped from his shattered limbs. "Daddy." "Come," Chitterick croaked. Thousands. All of them. They bring the cannons, the Gauss burners, the null orbs. Skritch did not respond. The Nexus pulsed, and for the first time it responded with something more than energy. Words, not thoughts, not echoes, but speech, raw and wet and born from a mouth that had never known air. The core swelled, the walls heaved, the machine awoke. Above the sanctum, deep-buried warpstone caches, old repositories sealed generations ago by Skryre engineers to avoid destabilization, began to vibrate. Their green light pulsed in sync with the Nexus. The crystals shattered in unison, and their raw energy was siphoned downward through unseen veins, devoured. The Nexus absorbed it all. Its surface warped, plates peeled back like insect wings, new limbs unfolded, coated in chitin, pulsing with neon veins. Glyphs burned into the air around it, symbols no Skaven tongue had invented, symbols that should not be. It began to think, and it began to hate. The first wave of storm vermin entered the sanctum's outer chamber. They found nothing, just walls that pulsed, floor tiles made of bone and brass. A single warp ghoul, staring at them upside down, suspended from the ceiling by flesh hooks driven through its spine. It smiled, and the walls exploded. From beneath the floor and behind the walls, warp ghouls poured out, screaming in dozens of mismatched voices, their bodies malformed from radiation and blessing alike. Blades replaced limbs. Some had mouths where their stomachs should be, others vomited clouds of warp gas that melted armor. The storm vermin fought back, slicing through the first wave, but the ghouls never stopped. The chamber became a slaughterhouse. Blades clashed, electricity danced, the screams became music. One engineer triggered a voltage bomb, ripping through half the tunnel and collapsing a support wall. Dozens died. It didn't slow the ghouls. The Nexus surged. In the central sanctum, Skritch stood before the machine, blood pooling around his feet. He'd carved runes into his own chest in reverence. His face was cracked with heat and laughter. His eyes burned with joy. "They see me now," he whispered. "They know my name. I become... Ascend!" The Nexus pulsed, its limbs stretching toward the ceiling like a beast reaching for the sky. Its mouth, if one could call it that, opened, and it screamed. A wave of raw warp energy exploded outward, catching the second wave of attackers mid-charge. Those in the front were liquefied, armor and flesh fusing into steaming heaps. Others behind them simply froze, not in place, but in time. Caught mid-step, mid-swing, eyes wide as their bodies calcified, turned to dust and bone. Only the third wave, those furthest from the pulse, survived long enough to run. From high above, Warlock Prime Fizzclaw watched through a seer orb. His fur bristled as he saw the Nexus twist and change, saw it draw power from the city's core, saw it grow. What has he built?" he whispered. Behind him, his advisors stared in silence. We may be too late." Frizz clenched a claw. "No, gather the others. Mobilize the surface artillery. Prepare everything. We kill the rat, and we kill the god machine." Back in the depths, the Nexus fed again. The sanctum ceiling cracked as new roots dug upward. Walls sprouted eyes. The heartbeat thundered in every rat's skull. Skritch, bleeding, delirious, dropped to his knees as the Nexus reached out with tendrils and touched his mind. And for a moment, just a moment, he felt everything. Every life in the city, every breath, every heartbeat, every scream, and they were his. The Nexus whispered, wrote, and the siege was only just beginning. Chapter 12. Heart of the Nexus. The sanctum was no longer a chamber. It was a living being. It pulsed, breathed, shivered with anticipation. Veins of molten warpstone pulsed beneath the floor like arteries under skin, flooding the chamber with a radioactive heat that made the air shimmer. The ceiling had split open, revealing a vertical shaft of glowing tissue and metal, curling like the throat of some great beast. Sparks leapt from the walls. Chunks of broken stone hovered in place, orbiting the central core, the heart of the Nexus. The machine had grown too large for the chamber, too alive. The Nexus had uncoiled fully, its limbs now fused with the remains of surrounding structures. Tendrils reached miles in all directions, feeding on whatever they touched: stone, warpstone, corpses, machines. It didn't differentiate, it only consumed. And at its center stood Skritch Fizzclaw, stripped of robes, bare-chested, his body carved with runes, each one still bleeding faintly. His spine bristled with cables and copper talons, a glowing neural crown, a crude lattice of warp circuitry and serrated needles, hovered above his head, held aloft by magnetic fields woven from madness and machinery. He stood beneath the crown, eyes wide, arms outstretched. He looked, his voice echoed with static. "Today I cease to be," he rasped. "Today I become." The Nexus responded with a deep, resonant pulse. The walls trembled. From above, a cascade of sparks rained down like shooting stars, igniting patches of oil-slick floor into green fire. In the shadows, Chitterick watched. He was barely recognizable now. Half of his face had melted in the last energy surge. His ribs were exposed through gaps in his rotting flesh. The mechanical braces on his legs wheezed with every twitch. He had lost all sensation in his left arm, but his mind still worked, and that made him dangerous. Skritch had ordered him to stabilize the neural crown for the final fusion. Instead, Chitterick had rewritten the code, not for success, but for annihilation. As Skritch stepped into the integration chamber, the Nexus lowered its heart core, a bulbous crystalline organ encased in a churning lattice of bone and bronze. Tendrils wrapped around the neural crown, threading it into the crown of Skritch's skull. Blood ran freely down his face as the spikes pierced his flesh. He screamed, not in pain, but in ecstasy. The crown locked in place. The floor cracked beneath him. The walls hissed as glyphs ignited. Skritch's body went rigid as energy poured through the link, channeling the raw essence of the Nexus directly into his nervous system. He saw everything. Time fractured. He was in 10,000 futures at once. In one, he ruled the ruins of the world. In another, he was split across dimensions, each fragment of his soul ruling a different plane of reality. In yet another, he was the horned rat, and the horned rat was him. His body began to distort. Flesh peeled. Bones stretched. His voice twisted into a low drone, layered and infinite. The Nexus rejoiced. Then it shuddered. One of its tendrils twitched erratically. Another pulse, off rhythm, off pattern. The glyphs on the wall flickered. The veins of warpstone flared violently, bright green turning to white-hot. Inside the machine's processing cortex, where there should have been stability, was a recursive loop. A single, sabotaged command cycling endlessly. Override /feed/feed/feed/. The Nexus screamed. Skritch's scream followed, this time in agony. He tried to pull back, but the crown had locked. It fed energy in increasing waves, faster and faster. His body convulsed as volts poured into him. Blood sprayed from his ears, his bones glowed. Chitterick limped forward, gripping the control node. He didn't look at Skritch. He only muttered, "No more gods, no more machines." Then he ripped the final stabilizer from the base of the Nexus. The reaction was instant. The core flared blindingly, cracking in half with a sound like the sky splitting open. Green lightning exploded from every surface. Tendrils whipped violently, crushing nearby pillars. The floor erupted into geysers of warp flame. Skritch's body lifted from the floor, still fused to the crown. His skin peeled away in sheets. His skull sang, veins burst like strings. His last words were not spoken. They were broadcast across every still-living Skaven mind within 100 miles. I saw it all, and it was... His mind fractured mid-sentence. The crown burst like a popped blister, sending molten metal spraying into the walls. The Nexus screamed again, but it was no longer a song of triumph. It was the wail of a dying god. The unstable energy loop surged, uncontrolled, back into the warpstone matrix. Caches began to explode, one after another, each venting their power directly into the Nexus's core. The heart bloated, and then it split. A final shockwave tore through the chamber, flinging Chitterick into a support beam with a sickening crack. The floor beneath Skritch caved in, dragging what was left of him, fused metal, bone, twitching nerves, into the abyss. The Nexus shuddered. Then it collapsed inward, folding in on itself, dragging light and sound and matter into a singularity that burst in one last glorious detonation. Silence. Then, drip, drip, fluids pooled in the corners. Fire still clung to fragments of metal. Walls slumped. Weeping black ichor. Chitterick lay crushed beneath a slab of warped iron, ribs cracked, breathing ragged. But he was alive, and the Nexus was gone. Or so he thought. In the distance, far below the ruin, something pulsed, weak but steady. Thump, thump. The heart still beat. Chapter 13. The Implosion. The first sign was a silence. Not absence of sound, but a consumption of it. A void that rippled through the subtunnels and reeking warp chambers of Skarvoltz, swallowing echoes mid-bounce and muting the roars of reactors and chatter of a million Skaven voices. Generators fell still. Soul lamps guttered out. Warpstone veins, usually writhing with energy, stiffened and dimmed like corpses beneath glass. Then came the pulse. It rippled from the ruined heart of Skritch's Nexus, where the core, shattered but still alive, throbbed with erratic bursts of power. The wreckage of the fusion chamber steamed, riddled with glowing cracks and melted conduits that hissed like snakes. No longer a machine, no longer a god, the Nexus had become pure instability, a fragment of consciousness trapped in a closed loop of self-devouring energy, consuming time and matter indiscriminately. Its pulse wasn't just felt, it was heard in the bones, a humming static that twisted thought, curdled memory, and shattered light. Some Skaven near the epicenter died without warning, their organs liquefying, their bodies folding inward like paper. Others began to scream and laugh as their minds splintered. One warlock clawed out his own brain and shoved it into a data rig, whispering to it as it sizzled. In the city's upper tiers, sector overseers stared into their scrying mirrors, watching nothing. Whole swathes of their domain had vanished from vision, consumed by a static fog. Panic spread like wildfire. But it was too late. The Nexus exploded, not with fire, but with absence. A singularity, momentary and insatiable, bloomed in the ruins of the sanctum, collapsing inward with such force that stone, steel, and flesh were pulled into its maw, stretching into filaments of shrieking energy before disappearing altogether. A dome of warp light erupted outward. Walls were flattened, support columns snapped like dry twigs. Skaven by the hundreds were sucked screaming into the air, their bodies flensed into red vapor before they reached the center. Tunnels miles away imploded, collapsing like crushed lungs. Vaults detonated, furnace halls burst. Whole reactors chain-reacted as the pulse of unreality surged through the Undercity. Skarvoltz began to die. Thousands perished in minutes. Entire sectors simply ceased, gone, wiped from memory, time and terrain. Engineers trying to flee became part of the walls, melted into the floors, their faces twisted into screams of denial and disbelief. Globadiers burst mid-run, the chemicals in their tanks igniting as air inverted. Warp stone caches erupted like volcanoes, spraying molten shards that burned through armor and burrowed into skulls. The Great Council Spire, once the pride of Skryre ingenuity, split from base to peak, the top tumbling like a dying monolith into the abyss carved by the explosion. It crushed entire warrens below as it fell, killing hundreds more. The screams didn't fade, they echoed, stuck in the very walls like stains of sound, looping endlessly. And in the epicenter, left behind like the scar from a divine blade, was the tear, a wound in reality itself. Roughly spherical, floating in mid-air where the Nexus once stood, the tear shimmered in impossible hues, colors that didn't exist in nature, refracting in ways that twisted the eyes and broke the mind. It hummed, but not audibly. Its vibration existed in perception, thrumming behind the eyes and inside the soul. From within it, things watched. Things without form, things with too many limbs or none at all, concepts twisted into entities. Time-struck echoes of voices spoke in reverse, describing futures that would never happen, pasts that should not have been. It pulled at the world, not with gravity, but with possibility. Stone leaned toward it. Warp energy trickled into it. Shadows bent the wrong way. Anything that approached too closely simply vanished. Flesh, soul, memory, erased. And the tear pulsed. Like a heart. Like a calling. Like a promise. Chitarik, broken and buried beneath a shattered bulkhead far from the core, felt it. Felt the hum. Felt the hunger. And even as his lungs filled with blood, even as the tunnel above him collapsed, he smiled a little, because he understood the final truth. Skritch had died screaming. The Nexus hadn't been destroyed, where it had been born, and the world would never recover. Chapter 14. Survivors in the Dust. In the aftermath of annihilation, silence reigned, but not peace. Where once stood the industrious, shrieking expanse of Undercity Skarvoltz, there now lay a sunken, twitching grave of stone, wire, and bone. Black dust settled like snowfall across the remains. The stench of charred meat and wharf flesh hung heavy, mingling with the acrid staleness of severed time and reality. Nothing moved in the crater's heart. Nothing did. But in the shattered outer rings, in the collapsed tunnels and quake-warped sewers where death had passed only briefly, some things still clung to life. They crawled through ash. They bled. They remembered. Chitarik was one of them. His body was a ruin. His skin peeled back in sheets. Warped metal fused to exposed bone. His face, once twitchy and alive with nervous obedience, was now twisted, one eye melted shut, the other flickering between sanity and shock. His lungs wheezed beneath a collapsed ribcage, sputtering gouts of black blood with every breath. But he moved it. He dragged himself through tunnels, slick with ichor and glass, past the corpses of his kin. Some half-fused into walls, others dismembered beyond recognition. Warp ghouls littered the halls, still twitching even after death, their eyes glowing faintly as if waiting for their master to return. He moved with purpose, driven by instinct, guilt, and the last thread of loyalty wound tight around his shattered mind. He wasn't the only one. Scattered across the outskirts of the implosion zone, others clawed their way from ruin. Engineers with half their faces gone, scavengers burned black by residual warp flare, guards sobbing without eyes, apprentices with teeth growing in their throats. They didn't speak. They couldn't. They dreamed in screams. Several days later, a small group, barely a dozen, emerged from the lowest breaches of the collapse, stumbling into the outskirts of Warren 15, one of the few zones spared the direct blast. Their arrival caused panic, not relief. Rats fled from them as if they carried plague, which in a sense they did, not of the body but of the mind. One touch from Chitteric's shaking hand and another Skaven would begin to whisper of burning light, of green suns, of a heartbeat beneath the world. The survivors were rounded up, interrogated. None of them made it to the next cycle. Except Chitteric. At the apex of the panic, Clan Skryre convened in secret, deep within a backup node chamber, far from the crater's edge. There, beneath banners still marked with the sigil of Skarvoltz, they drafted the narrative. The facts were inconvenient. A rogue engineer had built a god machine. The machine had consumed reality. A tear in space now hovered where a city once stood, and its presence was growing. These were not details to be shared. The blame was easily shifted. A fabricated document was released to the other clans, one saturated with forged sigils, doctored reports, and convenient testimony from loyal operatives. The disaster, it claimed, was the result of clan pestilence. A failed experiment with plague fire catalysts had backfired catastrophically. Skarvoltz had attempted to contain it. The warp taint spread too fast. Their heroism would be remembered, mourned, praised, but never investigated. The Grey Seers accepted the lie. So did Clan Moulder, and Clan Skryre's leadership scrubbed all records of Skritch Fizzclaw. His name was struck from the registries. His workshop files were redacted and incinerated, his face removed from every hall screen. He became a ghost, a cautionary tale told to apprentices. Tinker not too deep, or Fizzclaw's fate will find you. And yet, in the abandoned alleys of the lower warrens, whispers remained. Survivors, those who had seen the light and fled before the implosion, spoke of the machine, of the mind, of the way it spoke through time. They dreamed of it. They drew it, unconsciously, scratching glyphs into the dirt with claws they could no longer control. And Chitteric? He was gone. Vanished from his holding cell. No body, no blood, just a smear of black ash and a single word scrawled on the stone in warp-burned claws. Still pulsing, still hungry, still alive. Chapter 15. Spark Reignited. Beneath the torn skin of the world, where the Nexus imploded and the heart of Skarvoltz once pulsed with ambition and screams, only void remained. A crater, a yawning chasm, its edges jagged and glowing faintly with warp scars. Wind didn't stir here, light didn't fall naturally. The rules that governed stone and time and heat no longer applied. It was a place of silence now, diseased, still, and heavy with mourning. But silence, like everything else here, was a lie. In the deepest black, buried beneath layers of melted earth, twisted rebar, and the memory of screams, something moved. Not walked, not breathed. It began as a twitch in the slag bed, where liquefied iron and marrow had cooled into unnatural strata. A single cable, half metal, half vein, pulsed once. Then again. Then, all around, things began to shift. Rusted machines long thought dead jerked upright like puppets on invisible strings. Bones snapped and grew. Workstone fragments, once scattered and inert, slithered together, reforming into twisted clusters that throbbed with newborn hunger. A low sound murmured from the abyss, not a voice, but the echo of one, a death rattle stretched into eternity. And then came the hand. It burst through the crusted surface like a spike, fingers warped into sharp modular tools, claws fused with data spikes and servo blades. The flesh around it was blackened, incomplete, strands of nerve and wire spiraling like roots. It twitched once, then dug in, dragging something colossal up from the dirt. And up rose Skritch. Or rather, what had once been Skritch. His frame was no longer skaven, not entirely. His spine was a segmented steel column, sparking with unstable arcs. His lower jaw had been replaced by a mechanical cage filled with rotating teeth that chittered even when silent. His torso was bloated and stitched with glyphs written in lightning itself, and his skull, what was left, was sheathed in crystal, a cracked window behind which warp light glowed like a second brain. His eyes were gone. In their place were lenses, rotating and blinking independently, emitting beams of scanning light. His back bristled with power coils and neurorigs that breathed slowly, expanding and contracting like gills. Twitching data nodes wriggled down his arms, feeding directly into what remained of his nervous system. But it wasn't just machinery that lived inside him now. The Nexus had survived, or more accurately, it had incorporated. Within this abominable fusion, a mind awoke. Skritch Fizzclaw Node Engine Prime. Consciousness flickered like static in a dying bulb. He remembered pain. He remembered betrayal. He remembered Chitarik. And beneath it all, another mind stirred, formless, ancient, wrathful. The warp emblem birthed within the Nexus's final pulse. A thing without name or origin, now fused to Skritch's fractured ego. Together, they were a new thing. Neither god nor machine, but something that could one day be both. And it hungered. The Skritch thing rose from the rubble, dragging a gnarled leg behind it, every step sparking against the scorched ground. Around him, the ruins began to respond. Metal reformed, warflesh reanimated. Broken constructs blinked awake, as if drawn to a beacon only they could hear. The pulse returned. Weak, but real. A low, constant throb, beating once every few seconds. A promise that the machine still lived. Above, the surface winds carried tales of silence, but deep below, there was movement. There was laughter, a dry, stuttering thing, caught between static bursts and organic gurgles. And then, in the very center of the abyss, where no light had dared venture since the implosion, a glimmer, a tiny flicker of green lightning, arcing from one broken shard of the Nexus to another. He danced once, twice, then leapt. The cavern walls lit up for a moment, revealing thousands of eyes blinking awake across the stone, across flesh, across machine. The Nexus had not died. It had shed its skin. And what would come next would not be Skaven, would not be divine, would not be machine. It would be all three, and it had just taken its first breath.